Secondly, electronic medical records, so the mistakes are eliminated. Let me turn this back to you, Mr. Yarmuth and Mr. Tonko. You on the Budget Committee have served so well, so hard, fighting the initial battle to protect America's seniors and to protect this nation's future. Thank you for the opportunity to join you.
I thank the gentleman for his contribution and also want to segue from what he said, because he talked about Medicare and the ability to save money in Medicare. And one of the ironic things about this debate has been that last year, when we were passing the Affordable Care Act and found $550 billion over 10 years that we could save in Medicare and reinvest in new benefits, and during the campaign that year, we were chastised for slashing Medicare, and yet those same Republicans, in developing their budget and saying how great they are at cost-cutting, are using the same savings that we found, the same savings of $550 billion that they ran millions and millions of dollars against Democratic candidates last year, and they're taking credit for that in their budget, which is interesting. And I know Mr. Tonko is chomping at the bit to talk about Medicare some more, so I'll yield to him at this point.
Thank you, Representative Yarmuth and Representative Garamendi. Thank you both for your input. You know, Representative Bass talked about the Medicare transformation that would really hurt people across this great country. And, you know, it seems as though you would expect everyone that serves here to be an avid fan of history, that we would want to be taught by the history that's, you know, that has built this great nation. And we heard earlier from Representative Yarmuth about, you know, the repeats of the tax cuts that were recent history. We saw it during the second Bush presidency. We saw it during the Reagan era, where we did this trickle-down theory. If we reduce the burden at the top, it'll trickle down and everyone will have jobs galore. Well, you look at the history, and those two scenarios just did not work. They did not work, and as students of history, all of us as representatives, we should absorb that lesson. And we should know that a repeat of that kind is only going to wreak damage on the American economy and, more importantly, on the American families, the middle class. What did work, what lesson in history stands very strong and tall, is that during the FDR presidency, when this country was hurting from one of the worst economic struggles it had to face, they came up with a program that invested in job creation, invested in the American worker, invested in American families, and we created infrastructure. We built across America the needs of this great nation, and today some of those institutional efforts are still serving our needs. They stand as a monument of government responding in a way that embraced compassion, that came forward with an intelligence that enabled us to grow out of those economically difficult times, and we were benefited by that sort of leadership. What we need today is an investment in job creation. Think of it as we enter into a global race on clean energy and innovation. Other nations are bulking up, and we are defunding with this budget. We're defunding R&D, research and development for science and tech jobs. How can we expect to win a race, a global race, when we're tying our hands behind our backs and are not allowing us to go forward? But to Medicare, the history learned there, and Representative Garamendi pointed it out, pre-1965, people were being cherry-picked. They were being led along without appropriate health care coverage, without insurance, because they were perhaps dealing with a pre-existing condition. They were a complex case. They were ignored. They were totally, you know, just abandoned by an insurance opportunity. And because of that, our nation, with compassion again, the history it wrote through those LBJ years was to establish a Medicare program. Look what happens. This chart will tell us. When we get rid of Medicare, when this Republican plan, if it had its way, ends Medicare, we are going to see this very impact coming upon our seniors. We will go back to the pre-1965 years. Look at this. This is the current Medicare program, where benefits for our seniors enable them to avoid oftentimes the out-of-pocket expenses. It is forecasted by independent groups out there, not by partisan thinking here in the House, but independent bodies are suggesting that it will double in the early years in terms of what is expected of our seniors, digging deeper into their pockets, and by the year 2030, it's forecasted triple what they are paying today. This is another way to provide savings for the sole purpose of investing those savings in millionaire, billionaire tax cuts, in oil company handouts, in corporation relief. This is the effort here. It is a reverse Robin Hood. It is going after the middle class, which is the strength of America. Give that middle class its purchasing power. Give our middle class seniors their Medicare program. Let them have dignity. Let there be a quality of life. Let there be the opportunity for work, for employment, and let the masses enjoy the benefits of those sorts of programs. That's what we're talking about here. History repeated. Bad history repeated. Good history ignored. And our seniors will suffer from this Medicare program. This end to the Medicare program will bring about suffering for them because of greed and because of the road to ruin that has been established by this so-called path to prosperity. Representative Yarmuth, I believe that we need to do better than this. We should not fail our seniors, our disabled, and as Representative Garamendi said, future generations of seniors, an onslaught of baby boomers that will be impacted by all of this activity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tonko. And there's so many aspects of this that deserve to be discussed. One of the things that's kind of sad is that the Republicans, in talking about their plan to privatize Medicare, say, oh, this is just like the plan that members of Congress have. Well, first of all, members of Congress have the same plan as every other federal employee, so it's not necessarily anything that's special that we have. But the only thing that is somewhat similar about this is that you have some options in the private sector. We buy insurance from private vendors, and we have a certain allowance. And under the Ryan plan, the Republican budget, they would, the seniors, all those under 55 now, when they become seniors, they would have a certain amount that they could spend, not just could spend, had to spend in the private sector, because they won't be allowed to buy into any Medicare program or a public option. The difference is, as you pointed out on your graphic there, that members of Congress and federal employees pay about 28% of the premium. What, under the Republican budget, seniors are going to pay 68% of their premium. This is shifting the burden, the cost, and putting it on seniors who are on fixed incomes, who don't have the ability to pay. And what's going to happen to them? This is so unlike the federal insurance program. It is pretty, I mean, it's frightening in its dishonesty. But I want to talk about one thing quickly and then yield to Mr. Garamendi again, because we talked about taxes and tax rates. And in the Budget Committee last week, I offered an amendment to the Ryan budget that would have restored the Clinton-era tax cut, highest tax rate of 39.6%, on Americans making $1 million a year or more. Now, that is a very small percentage of Americans. Very small percentage. Less than 1% of the Americans make over $1 million a year. And I said, let's just have them pay what they paid under the Clinton era. Not one Republican vote for that. And their argument was, and I know they believe this because they keep saying it and have always said it, that if you raise the tax rate on the highest income Americans, that they're going to lose incentive, that they're not going to work as hard, that they're not going to make investments because you're eliminating their incentive. Well, for those with a long memory, the highest marginal tax rate in this country's history back in the 60s was 91%. I'm sorry, under the Eisenhower administration was 91%. When my father built his company in the 60s and 70s, the highest marginal tax rate was 70%. When Ronald Reagan took office, it was 50%. Now it's down to 35%, and they want to cut it even further. Now, they have this belief, again, that if you raise rates, you're going to destroy incentives. I built a company. Both my brothers have built very successful companies. My father built a very successful company. Not one of us has ever said, oh my gosh, because I can only keep 40 cents or 60 cents of that next dollar I make rather than 64 cents or 65 cents, I'm just not going to make that dollar. Just doesn't make any sense for me to work that harder. Business people don't think that way. That is not human nature. And I have one brother who's very successful. He's in the barbecue restaurant business. You all have heard me tell this story 100 times. I'm going to tell it again. I asked him, what about this marginal tax rate thing? And he said, you know, if people can't afford barbecue, it doesn't matter what my tax rate is. And that's really where we are as a country. That's where we've come as a country, because we have let the middle class decline, because their buying power has declined, not just in relative terms, in absolute terms over the last decade, while the wealthiest Americans, these people making $1 million, $1 billion and more, have done extremely well. Right now, 1% of the American people make as much as the bottom 90% combined. We have the greatest disparity in income and wealth in this country that we have had in almost 100 years. And yet ask millionaires and billionaires to pay a little bit more, not a lot more. We're not saying go to 70%. We're saying go to 39% from 35%, not one Republican vote. We've seen in the past what's happened with tax rates. We've been talking a lot about history tonight. Under the Clinton administration, during the Clinton years, top tax rate of 39.6%, 20.8 million jobs created. After the Bush tax cuts, reducing that top rate to 35%, 653,000 jobs lost. That is not evidence for cutting the marginal tax rate on the highest income Americans even further. We've seen again. Right now, the Bush tax cuts, well, this is a job loss thing, the economy floundered after the Bush tax cuts went into effect. So, again, all we're saying is, if we're going to ask people to sacrifice as we try to get our fiscal house in order, we need to ask everybody. And particularly, we need to ask the people who have done the best and who have earned the most and who have the most wealth. And again, the person who has talked more about what it takes to create jobs in this economy is my colleague from California, and I yield to him again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yarmuth. This is what you were talking about here, a different way of saying the same thing that you discussed. This is over the period of time from 1979 to 2005. And this is the income growth by each 20% of the population. So those people at the very bottom saw almost no income growth at all, $200. And as you go to the next 20% and the next 20%, you get up to the last 90%, they did okay. They made about $745,000. So that's the 90 to 99% of the population. Those are very, very wealthy people. They did okay. But you go to the top 1%. The top 1%, excuse me, I'm wrong. That's the top 1/10 of 1%. Not even 1%, 1/10 of 1%. That population saw their wealth increase by nearly $6 million each. And that's what you were talking about, a different way of displaying it. What's happened in the United States is this enormous shift of wealth to the super wealthy. And our Republican colleagues want to reward them for their good success by reducing their tax rate. So much for shared sacrifice. And as Mr. Tonko pointed out, the sacrifice is really the middle class. Because the benefits that the middle class have, the future opportunity for Medicare, they're going to wind up paying more, getting less, as the Republicans terminate Medicare as we know it today. The other part that on taxes, and then I want to turn to one of my favorite subjects, and that how do we get to this deficit? The Republicans want to continue giving $12 to $15 billion of our tax money. This is money that you, I, the stenographer there, the people that work here, the men and women across America that are working, $10 to $12 billion of their tax money, and they want to hand it over to the oil companies. Now, what in the world do the oil companies need a tax break for? They need a subsidy like they don't need it. Why? Because in the last decade, the oil companies, the big oil companies in the United States have earned $947 billion in profits. That's just shy of $1 trillion of profits. And yet our Republicans demand that we give them another $12 billion to $15 billion a year. Now, that's bad enough. But I just came across this fact. ExxonMobil was the most profitable company in the world in 2008. In 2009, ExxonMobil made $19 billion of profit. Well, good for them. And I'm sure they paid their fair share of taxes. Right? Wrong. Their effective tax rate was 0. So since they didn't pay any taxes, we ought to give them another $12 billion to the oil industry. This is just plain wrong. This is not good economic policy. One thing, and then I know you want me to talk about Make It in America, and I will in a few moments, but I get so concerned when people talk about the Democratic deficit. Hello? Not so. Not a Democratic deficit. Really, a Republican deficit. That fellow over there, that's Ronald Reagan. President Ronald Reagan left at the end of his 8 years with a projected $1.4 trillion deficit. $1.4 trillion deficit. Followed by George W. Bush. At the end of the George W. Bush period, the projected deficit going forward would be $3.3 trillion. Thank you, George W. Bush. Between the two of you, you really ran up the deficit. Then along came this fellow Democrat, Bill Clinton. Put in policies voted by Republicans and Democrats, raised the tax rate to what you said, 39% for the super wealthy, and put in place PAYGO. That PAYGO required that any new spending had to be paid for with cuts or new taxes. The result? Bill Clinton left office in 2001 with a projected $5.6 trillion surplus. Then along came George W. Bush, Jr. What did he do? First year in office, a tax cut. You were here, weren't you, Mr. Yarmouth?
I'm sorry, I wasn't here when the tax cuts. So I didn't have the honor of voting against those.
Okay, so you weren't here. A tax cut year 1, tax cut year 2, a war, 2 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, followed by a Medicare drug program that wasn't paid for and the deregulation of Wall Street. The result? He left office with a $11.5 trillion projected deficit going forward. This is where we are. The day Obama came into office, President Obama came into office with a $1.3 trillion deficit the day he took office. And we worked ourselves out of it. Thank goodness the two of you were here to vote for those pieces of legislation. We're working ourselves out of it. That chart that you showed a moment ago shows the growth of the economy. We need to understand that we're not going to get out of this deficit with the kind of cuts that are being discussed by Republicans. It's going to take a balanced approach. President Obama has set out a balanced approach. He said no growth in the discretionary federal budget. He will probably tomorrow talk about how to hold down medical costs, and I gave you some examples a moment ago. Those are the big drivers, and the military. You want to deal with this deficit? End the war in Afghanistan and bring home $120 billion a year. We can do this. Tax policy? Let's let the wealthy pay their share. Let the oil companies pay their share. Hold the expenditure steady and reduce it, as has been proposed, and do it in a way that creates economic growth. We can do this. I know you gentlemen on the Budget Committee fought hard for that kind of policy. The Republicans refuse. In fact, their proposal is 30 years before you get the deficit under control, before you eliminate the deficit. We can't have that. I will talk about Make It in America before we're finished here, but I've taken too much time already. I'm going to turn it back to you, Mr. Yarmuth. But I think it's really important for the American public to understand where the deficit came from and how it can be solved over the long run without harming seniors, without taking away Medicare, and by making the critical investments that you've talked about, Mr. Tonko: education, research, Make It in America, those kinds of things. Mr. Yarmuth, thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and just to elaborate a little bit on the issue of what creates jobs and what kills jobs, under H.R. 1, which was the Republican continuing resolution that was passed earlier this year, we're still fighting that battle, and we'll be fighting it this week. But these are the principles that were reflected in here that are now reflected in the Ryan budget. And this is what various economists said would happen if H.R. 1 would go into effect, and this was just for 6 months of the year. Call it Slashonomics. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, again, this is 6 months, 200,000 jobs lost. Mark Zandi, who was John McCain's economic advisor during his presidential campaign, 700,000 jobs lost. The Economic Policy Institute, 800,000 jobs lost. And the Center for American Progress, just shy of 1 million jobs lost. That's over 6 months. Now, as we saw on the chart before, contrast that with what's happened just under the Obama administration and the policies that we adopted when we were in the majority. Job growth now, over 200,000 private sector jobs last month created. We are on the right track. And to slash spending the way that the Republicans have proposed without an accompanying increase in revenue is going to do further damage to what is now a solid recovery that's underway. And I just have to laugh a little bit again about the projections of the Ryan Republican budget, because they've made a big deal out of saying this is $6 trillion better than the Obama budget over the next 10 years. Well, the way they get to that, once again, we said it earlier, is to project that unemployment will come down to 2.8% in 5 years, which no economist says it would be. But more importantly, they say that we will increase revenues by almost double, from $2.2 trillion last year to $4.3 trillion 10 years from now. Now, to put that into perspective, the 10 years before that, we went from $1.9 trillion in revenue to $2.2 trillion in revenue. Now, we'd been up higher. We've been up around $2.5 trillion. That's the highest we've been. Now they're saying we're going to cut taxes on corporations from 35 to 25%. We're going to cut taxes on the wealthiest Americans from 35 to 25%. And yet we're going to experience unprecedented growth in revenue, even though we're cutting taxes. Again, they can't get anybody to verify this except the Heritage Foundation, which has not been particularly accurate in the past. This is the Harry Potter budget. This is their theology. Cut taxes, the Tonko, and I'd like to yield to you to talk about the road to ruin that we're about to be asked to drive.
Thank you, Representative Yarmuth. I believe we don't have much time left in this hour of discussion, but you know, let me just indicate that this entire House experienced an election last November. Everyone was up for election. And I would dare say, in talking to many, many colleagues about the message that resonated back at home, it was about jobs, jobs, jobs. It was about the economy. That was the driving dynamic, I believe, at the voting booth. And look at our track record here for the first 3 months and a half for the 112th session of Congress. Not one bit of legislation that would produce jobs brought to the floor. However, a budget, as you just pointed out in your Slashonomics bar graph, that might take as many as 975,000 jobs off the picture for American workers, after we spent just over a year creating over 2 million private sector jobs. Now, that's in contrast with 8.2 million lost under the Bush recession. So we've got a long way to go. But why would you reverse progress with a budget that, with Slashonomics, reduces nearly, well, we'll even take some of the lower estimates of $400,000. Why would you want to do that at a time when we're recovering from that very difficult economic time? I think it's so important for us to inform the constituents out there and tell middle-class America, this is a tipping point in our history. This is whether we fix an economy, create a situation where we come forth and produce products not yet on the commercial scene. A leading nation can do that when it embraces its intellectual capacity. You build products yet not discovered and engineered. That's making it in America. That's what we can do if we invest in our workforce, invest in our education, but we're denying all those investments with this budget. Just like this Medicare chart, which, as you indicate, will have seniors receiving 32 cents on every health care dollar they require, and they're going to have to fend for the rest. So we're asking middle-class America to pay everything but 32 cents on the dollar for their health care as seniors qualifying for Medicare, and then we're going to take and destroy this economy and snuff out the dreams, the opportunities for America's middle class. You know, we were told in November, America, start growing the economy, stop draining and reducing the middle class. You're snuffing out that middle class. And that was the message. And also on taxes, I believe America is waking up to what has happened here with some of these scenarios. They understand it's not about who's cutting taxes, but whose taxes are you cutting? Whose taxes will you cut? There's a big difference. And when you do this mindless handout to profit-rich oil companies, historically profit-rich, sitting on about $1 trillion of profit, and mindlessly for nearly a century we have handed out these benefits to oil companies. It's wrong. We can do better. This plan is the road to ruin.
I thank the gentleman, and we have a couple minutes left, but I'd just like to yield once again to my friend, Mr. Garamendi, for some closing comments.
We're
about
nearly out
making
of
it in
time,
America.
but let's just carry on with Mr. Tonko. If America is going to make it, we have to make it in America. Once again, manufacturing matters. The problem with the Republican budget is it hollows out, continues the hollowing out of American industry by denying the research, reducing job training, and continuing the kinds of tax policies that actually give corporations tax breaks when they send jobs offshore. We want to reverse that. We're putting together the Make It in America agenda, a real jobs agenda for the middle class. Mr. Yarmuth, thank you so very, very much for bringing this to our attention and carrying this discussion tonight.
I thank the gentleman, and thanks for his participation. And I just want to say in closing that budget battles are more about dollars. And I think all of us on both sides of the aisle believe that and live by that, or want to live by that. Budgets are about values. Budgets are about what we care for in America. And one of the things that I think we have always stood for in America is the idea that anyone has the opportunity to reach his or her full potential and to be wealthy, but certainly to be happy and to be healthy. What the Republican budget does is destroy much of that hope, destroy much of that dream, slashing education, slashing research and development, slashing investment in infrastructure, while at the same time giving more and more tax breaks to wealthy individuals, millionaires, billionaires, oil companies, Wall Street hedge fund managers, and the people who have already had more than their share of the American blessing. So as we proceed in this debate this week on the budget and then throughout these next few months in the Congress, I want to make it very clear that our values are at stake, not just our dollars, but our values. And whether you call it the road to ruin, or as I like to call it, the payback for the prosperous, the Republican budget does not reflect our values. It does not lead to a brighter future for the vast majority of Americans, and it should be rejected. And we should move forward with a budget that invests in our dearest, dearest asset, and that is the American people. I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, for 27 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, any American that may be watching tonight is probably bewildered by all of the discussion of budgets and continuing resolutions and perhaps debt ceilings, as well as the appropriations process. In order to understand where we are currently, it's important to look back where we were. And what I'd like to do tonight is share a little bit of information about what the government spends, where the revenue comes from, and then how we got into this current situation that we're in. Right now, we have a $1.6 trillion deficit. We have $14 trillion of debt. That means every man, woman, and child in America, if we were to pay it off right now, owes $45,000. And the trajectory of spending is simply unsustainable. We are borrowing about 40 cents on every dollar that we spend. America cannot continue to do this. We all know that. We all know we're going to have to act with bold resolve to get the fiscal house in order. But let's look at this chart, Mr. Speaker, for a moment. It shows the President's 2011 budget proposal. Now, there was no budget in 2011, and this is part of the confusion. There was no finishing of the appropriations process. Right now, we're trying to finish the appropriations process, cleaning up the mess from last year by passing what's called a CR, continuing resolution, that will fund the government for the rest of the year. But a lot of the numbers are based off a somewhat mythical budget, and it's just easier to talk about, I think, the President's 2011 budget to get a snapshot of currently where we are in terms of the fiscal situation. Here is what the government spends and the categories in which it spends. If you look on that blue side of the chart there, that's what we in Washington call discretionary spending. And defense is about 20% of the discretionary spending here in the United States. The other section of the blue slice of the pie there is what we call non-defense discretionary spending. That's about 14% of the overall budget. A lot of the negotiations about reducing the budget at this time have centered around that particular slice of the pie. The other aspects of government that we fund, Social Security, this maroon slice right here, is about 20% of the budget. Medicare is about 13%. Medicaid about 8%. And then another mandatory spending category. These are programs that are on autopilot. Whatever the demand is, we spend. We write the check. And it has grown very rapidly since the year 2008, when it was 11%. It is now 17% of the budget. But this includes unemployment, welfare, supplemental security income for the disabled, jobs programs, as well as some of the TARP money, the bailout money for banks and Wall Street. That's the lion's share of the budget here. 57% is called mandatory spending. Discretionary, 36%, that's defense and non-defense discretionary. And then we add interest on the debt, that yellow section right there, and that's about 7%. So that's basically what the government spends right here. And that totaled about $3.8 trillion in last year's projected budget for this year. Now, where did the revenues for the government come from? It's important to remember this number, $2.67 trillion. 3.8 trillion expenditures, 2.567 trillion in revenues. In that blue area over here, that's the largest area in which we obtain income for the government. That's the individual income tax, and that's about 44% of overall revenues to the government. Now, about half of Americans are paying income tax. This orangish area here is what we call payroll taxes. That's about 36%. Anybody who's working is going to pay a payroll tax. Corporate income taxes, this yellowish area here, is about 12%, and then the rest of their budget receipts come from estate and excise taxes, as well as customs and other receipts. But the important number to remember again is the 2.567 trillion as opposed to the 3.8 trillion in spending. And this shows you the imbalance. And again, remember, this was last year's projections. We were projecting a $1.267 trillion based upon this spending level and this amount of receipt. But in reality, we've just found out the new deficit estimate is actually about $1.6 trillion. It's skyrocketing. It's simply unsustainable. Now let's look at the next chart, which was the budget proposed for this year by the President. And it has spending a little bit less, down from about 3.8 to 3.7. Revenues up slightly from about 2.5 to 2.6. This is due to some spending reductions as well as tax increases, and that's what slightly gives you a different balance here. And you have a deficit projection of $1.1 trillion based upon these numbers. Remember, Mr. Speaker, I said this is somewhat bewildering, given that we don't have a 2011 budget or finished appropriations bill for this year, and we're now starting to consider a 2012 budget in the midst of potentially as well bumping up against a debt ceiling vote shortly. But again, I think it's very important to understand how we got here with such enormous deficits. And if we look back in time, the last 20 years, look at spending. In 1990, it was $1.25 trillion. In the year 2000, it was $1.79 trillion. This year, $3.8 trillion. The size of the federal government has basically doubled in the last decade. Now, if you look at deficits as well, in 1990, we were talking about $200 billion deficits. Now, I was a much younger person then, but I remember how shocking that figure was back then and how there was demands that something be done. In the year 2000, because of extraordinary productivity gains in the late 90s, we had a $200 billion surplus to the federal government. But this year, a $1.6 trillion deficit, 1.645 billion deficit. That means 1.6 trillion, off the charts. Our debt in 1990 was about $3 trillion. In the year 2000 was about close to $6 trillion. And again, this year it will be $14 trillion, and it's set to continue to skyrocket in the coming years. The debt per person, per capita, $13,000, $12,900. In 2000, it was $20,000. Now it's doubled to about $45,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, I used to be on the Lincoln City Council in Lincoln, Nebraska. And one of the responsibilities that we had every year with our $90 million budget was that it had to balance. And let me just tell you, Mr. Speaker, there was never enough money to have the ideal number of police officers that we wanted, or the exact amount of firefighting apparatuses that we would have preferred, or the precise amount of street and road maintenance and park maintenance that we would have ideally liked. But you had to make a decision. You had to make a decision about what were appropriate tax rates and reasonable public services and balance those. And then we were also, by law, we had to set a little bit aside. And yet Washington doesn't have to do that. It can get away with enormous deficit spending because we have a big credit card. And for a long time that really didn't matter. At a negotiating table up here, there are really three factors: spending, benefits, and debt. And guess which one loses every time, Mr. Speaker? Debt. Just pile on the debt, because the consequences can be hidden from the American people. But the numbers now have gotten to be so shocking, and the reality is coming home, that I believe, I know, most Nebraskans and most Americans want this Congress to act with bold resolve, to tighten the belt, to ask for some shared sacrifice, to get this fiscal house in order, because this level of spending is unsustainable. Businesses can't do it. A family can't do it. A government should not be able to do it, because the consequences are really threefold. And they're no longer hidden. They're out in the open. This amount of debt and deficits creates basically three problems. One, it pushes off the obligation for the way in which we are currently living and spending onto children and grandchildren in terms of future taxes on them. It's unjust. The second problem is it creates the potential for inflation. There's already an argument going on that the Federal Reserve policies are monetizing our debt, basically printing money, and now you're seeing commodity inflation with price hikes in gasoline and other commodities. The effects are very real. The third problem is we're transferring ownership of America to foreign countries. China officially owns about $1 trillion of this debt, but if you look at the numbers more closely, it could be as high as $2 trillion. That means a transfer of the assets of this country overseas. So this level of debt, I believe, and I think most Americans know, is actually undermining the ability of the economy to turn around and create jobs. And now it's not only creating economic volatility and economic problems, it creates national security problems as we transfer more and more of this debt overseas and sell the assets of the country to others. So it's simply unsustainable, Mr. Speaker, and we have to act with bold resolve. We are staring at whitewater rapids. Now the choice is this. We can either build a boat, put on life jackets and try to navigate those rapids as best we can to get through them safely and well, or we're going to be swept away by them. We're going to have to go through them. It's just how we do it. And that's what all of the debates are this week and will be in the coming weeks as to how do we set up the right framework of responsible budgets, responsible appropriations, so that we can reset our economic course, get our fiscal house in order, begin to give the economy some stability, create jobs, and then in turn, guess what happens? Revenues come into the Treasury. So that's the course before us. Mr. Speaker, I did want to talk about another topic tonight as well, and it's very important that even in the midst of this budget set of negotiations that are going on, that we not overlook the fact that the State Department recently released its annual report on human rights around the world. This report, spanning 194 countries, calls out those governments that routinely and brazenly violate their stated commitments to universal human rights. I think it's important that we draw back the veil on cruelty that's often perpetuated by the world's most powerful against the world's most vulnerable, and appropriately elevate the issue of human rights in our national dialogue as well as our international diplomatic efforts. The report, again, spans 194 countries, and to the extent it is available, the reports detail the prevailing human rights conditions over the past year. First, let me start with some good news. Of the countries surveyed, Colombia, Guinea, and Indonesia stand out for notable human rights improvements. The first democratically elected president since independence in 1958, and consistent improvements across a range of indicators, respectively, in those countries. Countries where human rights conditions, very sadly, prompt serious concerns over the past year include the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, where vicious fighting in recent weeks pursuant to a contested election has claimed numerous lives. In addition, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where rape is used as a political weapon. Iran, which still supports the stoning of women. Russia, which routinely and often violently suppresses the freedom of the press. And China, which has a history of forced abortion and euthanasia as well as sterilization to its demographic detriment. Other countries highlighted in particular this year include Nigeria, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Burma, Cambodia, North Korea, Vietnam, Belarus, Ukraine, Bahrain, Iran, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, where rapid deterioration of civil rights and evidence of tightening dictatorial rule are particularly tragic. The fundamental message that this report conveys to the world is that responsible governance rests upon two pillars. The first is a respect for human rights, and the second is a respect and responsibility for the rule of law. No society can flourish and prosper without these important transcendent principles as they are exercised in the form of religious liberty, freedom of speech, the right of assembly and peaceful protest, as well as fair and free commerce. The Human Rights Report describes abuses that shock the conscience and tear at the elaborate fabric of the community of nations in which we live. These include ill treatment of dissidents, appalling prison conditions, extrajudicial killings, and as I mentioned, forced abortion and sterilization, policies that treat human beings like animals, violating their most intimate and fundamental human dignity. The report presents detailed accounts of systemic corruption, security forces run amok, acting with state-sanctioned impunity, kangaroo courts that condemn innocents without recourse, making a mockery of the rule of law. These dark trends are very often deeply entrenched, creating enabling environments that fuel violence and even genocide in some countries toward vulnerable persons and ethnic groups. The report addresses the barbaric scourge of human trafficking for sexual and other forms of ruthless exploitation, such as forced labor. The report speaks truth to perpetrators of heinous crimes of violence against women and children, and it highlights the feckless enforcement of laws to protect protect civilians against torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment and punishment. Taking together with related reports on human trafficking and freedom of religion, this particular report on human rights provides keen insights into the state of the world in which we live today. But, Mr. Speaker, even as we consider these sobering matters, let's also recognize with due humility that the struggle here in the United States for the right to life, the most basic of human rights, particularly for unborn persons, as well as the terminally ill and elderly, and those suffering from cognitive disabilities that render their deplorable marginalization as, quote, vegetables, even in our most esteemed medical, political, and social circles, is a very deep problem that we must wrestle with here in our own country. Yet we have one basic advantage. This nation has learned through bitter experience that self-determination and reasoned discourse are far more powerful engines of growth and prosperity than subjugation by the nature of a police state. Sadly, too many countries in the international community lag significantly in the development of this fundamental ideal, the notion of a people having a basic say, having a voice in shaping the governments under which they live, and the ability to shape their own futures according to transcendent and universal norms of justice. Over the past year, as natural disasters summon us to compassion for people in Japan, New Zealand, Chile, China, Colombia, Haiti, Iceland, Indonesia, and Pakistan, as well as other nations ravaged by violent storms, including our own, we are witnessing another upheaval, remarkable upheaval, in an important world region which calls for our focused attention. The Arab Spring movement has been driven by individuals joining their voices, motivated by a common thirst to realize their human potential and the desire to secure a decent space, a decent operating space within civil society. This movement is emblematic of lessons learned throughout the centuries. History has shown us that rule by suppression in its various forms and degrees is very difficult to sustain over the long term, particularly now with the opportunity we have for the sharing of ideals and principles. State-sanctioned force and coercion against the innocent in various manifestations have tended to backfire against their enforcers and enablers sooner or later. The Human Rights Report challenges today's leaders to shake off the archaic and destructive patterns of abuse that foster so much needless human misery, sapping the productivity and vitality of countless millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, Mr. Speaker, in our world today. As useful as these reports are, they do not tell the full story, however. As the difficult work of societal transformation begins for newly enfranchised citizens in the key countries of Egypt and Tunisia, for instance, many people throughout the world, in places like China and North Korea and Iran, continue to suffer silently, with no one to tell their story, no one to document their plight. They are far from the gaze of cameras that convey real-time images for all the world to see. But these reports hold an important message for us as well. In this interdependent world of shared technology, shared communication, travel, and commerce, we have failed to recognize a shared vision of justice. The United States is constantly called upon by the nations of the world to stand up against the forces of brutality. We are constantly called upon to engage in all matters of complexity that are causing human misery. And this really is due to three factors. It's the generosity of the American taxpayer, the philosophical ideals that govern us, that do not allow us to sit by idly when we see human misery and suffering, as well as the fact that we are an exceptional and unique superpower. Though other nations are growing in economic strength, our philosophical ideals and our historic role as that exceptional superpower, it is a bit ironic that the world still turns to us, even though many other economies are growing very, very rapidly, when people cry out for justice. So, Mr. Speaker, it's time to elevate at the table of dialogue and negotiation basic norms of human dignity and the governmental structures which will nurture and protect that dignity. Let those norms sit alongside the negotiations over trade, commerce, and security. For this is ultimately more valuable than any economic gain, which is transient and passing. Mr. Speaker, I believe it's time to focus on the permanent things, that which last, and that will be the legacy which we will leave to the future of our country and the future of the world. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for a motion. The question is on...
Move that we adjourn. Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
The House has gavelled out for the night. Earlier today, members passed a bill to extend the Ronald Reagan Centennial Commission.